Shalom Aleichem and welcome, God, these are getting worse, to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we're going to be talking about Heroes and Henchmen. This is kind of a lore spotlight, but it's kind of a mechanics-y spotlight, so you know what, I'm not going to classify this one for today, but I saw a couple of comments about it, and in fact somebody in one of the later videos brought it up, and I realised I had been planning on doing it, but I'd kind of forgotten, and it just slipped off my radar. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, particularly because it's going to be kind of relevant to some of the lore summary stuff as well. In fact, the next video that I'll be putting up should be kind of interesting, something to do with that. But before I get ahead of myself, the footage in the background for today starts off coming from me, because a lot of you guys really liked that idea with the Guild Wars 1 footage in the background. There were a couple of people who said, oh no, this isn't a very good idea, but enough people liked it that I decided, you know what, let's try it. So even though it is a little bit of extra effort, I'll try and do it. You do have to understand that it won't always be synced up. I'm not going to be able to have enough time to sort that out, so I could be talking about one server while the background of another server's going on every now and then, which you will have seen last episode. But in general, no one complained about that. So yeah, it's a cool idea. I think we'll roll with it. But the start of this episode is actually the Arachnia Plateau, because obviously we didn't see that for the first server episode and somebody specifically requested it, so I thought, you know what, it's cool enough that I will show it to you. Also, you'll see a big kind of red area behind a portal on that footage. That there is the Spider's Heart, which is also some more information we got out of the guildwars.dat that I read out on that episode of Guild Wars 2 Daily. So it's like you've got Arachnia Plateau, and in the middle of the plateau is a portal that takes you to another area of the Realm of Torment, but is also the Spider's Heart, like this weird place. So it's kind of cool, kind of fucked up. I hope you enjoy it. Like I said, I just love how you can look out on the horizon and see these giant legs over you. You really do get a sense of the scale there. Some of the stuff in the Realm of Torment was really, really cool and really freaky. There were these areas with these big walls that had these big kind of lidless eyes just staring at you as you walked around it, which isn't necessarily an original idea to be in kind of a scary place, but it's really cool and really well done in Guild Wars. Anyway, that's the Arachnia Plateau. After that, there will be footage from the Technic going on in the background, so thanks very much to them for that. You can find a link down in the description. And lastly, the other thing I wanted to talk about before we came in is that it seemed like a lot of you haven't been in game a lot recently. You saw Razza was in my team there, and he's a necromancer. Yeah, just to clarify here, Razza now can be any profession you want him to be. When the game launched, when Guild Wars Nightfall came out, he was simply a ritualist, and that was the only profession he would have. However, if you read the manuscripts of Nightfall, it actually said that he could change any profession at all. But the truth was, ArenaNet never got round to actually finishing up that functionality for the game, so it wasn't there. And then way later, it was like a year ago now, this was added. Basically, the live team managed to figure it out, and they actually added this functionality finally into the game, so the manuscripts are correct, which is kind of cool. It was shocking to me how many people actually kind of mentioned that, though, because it just goes to show we might consider ourselves to be Guild Wars 1 players, and we know a lot about that game, but you might not have played it for a long time. A lot of people have left the game, and I don't blame anyone for that, but you'd be surprised. Certain things do change, and it's funny to see how they actually catch people off guard. But in any case, let's talk about Heroes and Henchmen. So one of the main reasons I wanted to do a spotlight on this is because with the lore summary, this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. And the question is, how do you actually talk about who participated in the events of Guild Wars 1? So we're telling this retelling of the game, but you can't really refer to the player character as they were going through, because everyone has a different player character, and not everyone's player character finished all of the content. So you can't directly refer to them. I can't say, oh, there was this male warrior that went through and completed the storyline of prophecies, because that doesn't actually exist in lore, because ArenaNet can't write that in the lore, because, you know, you might not have made a male warrior, you might have had a female mesmer that went through the game. So they're incredibly non-specific about that hero of Tyria that does actually exist in lore. It is this real thing that's there in lore, but ArenaNet never make any direct references to it because every player made different choices. So in Guild Wars 2, there's a very low chance that we'll actually see any references to this hero that existed, the player that went through the Guild Wars 1 stuff. There might be some small references, not that we've seen any yet. There might be some small little nods to that hero of all that time ago, but it would have to be something as vague as an unmarked grave that was kind of in commemoration for you or something, so everyone's choices still matter from the first game. So basically, I came to a point where I was having to think to myself, right, for this summary, whose eyes do we tell the story through? I didn't want to do it through this character that would never be introduced in Guild Wars 2 or never be relevant for Guild Wars 2, so who do we do it? Well, Guild Wars 1 has a large cast of different characters that you can choose from. And this is because Guild Wars 1 mechanically was designed as a game that would be entirely cooperative. ArenaNet took kind of a stance where they said, no, we don't really want any solo play to happen in Guild Wars 1. A lot of MMOs, what was kind of revolutionary about WoW, as far as I believe, is it was one of those early MMOs that actually let you go and solo loads of stuff, and it was actually a massive thing for WoW success. Guild Wars 1 was being developed and kind of came out quite close to where WoW did, but ArenaNet took the opposite stance, possibly the wrong one, where they essentially said, well, no, an MMO is about being sociable and cooperative. We're going to force everyone to always be in teams together. This is how we're going to design our content. Everyone's going to have to be in a team. And that's what they did. So all of the storyline now is, the idea is that a group of heroes actually went through and participated in all of the events of the games. ArenaNet weren't stupid. They knew that eventually the game would die down. There'd be less people. Their population would be more spread out or put into certain endgame areas or trading places, and you wouldn't find people in other areas. So from the off, they introduced these things called henchmen. This is what henchmen are. They are NPC allies. They are just controlled by the computer characters that you can, if you wish to, add to your party. And the idea is you're hiring them into your party, because when those henchmen are with you, they actually get a share of the gold that drops from enemies out there. So in theory, you are paying for their service. You just don't realise you're only paying on drops that you would otherwise get, which is kind of interesting. People always kind of forget about that, but you are really paying for henchmen in Guild Wars 1. But this is what these characters were. They served mechanically to allow you to complete all of this group content, despite the fact you weren't actually playing with other humans. And there was a very necessary part of the game. So when I was thinking about the lore summary, I was thinking, right, well, why don't I tell the story through the eyes of these henchmen that in lore could theoretically be credited as the heroes of the story of prophecies? But then we get to another problem with henchmen, in that not all henchmen were there all the time. Henchmen, it wasn't just you'd have the same set of henchmen for the entire overarching plot. Henchmen would come and go. If you were in Kryta, you'd have access to different henchmen than you would if you were somewhere in Alona, for example. And even within individual campaigns, the further you went on in the story, henchmen's faces changed. Certain ones, new ones came, and certain ones went away. And that was affected by things like how large the party size was and other reasons as well. So you couldn't really refer to the henchmen either, even though in theory they kind of were there for the events of the game. And I think ArenaNet appreciated that as well. They kind of saw that they hadn't established in lore a group of characters that really went through the whole story, and I think they solved that problem very quickly. They saw that there was this gap, and when the game launched, they actually, to solve it, introduced these 5 other characters that weren't always henchmen necessarily, but they were 5 characters that pretty much went through the story of all of the games. They went through the story of Nightfall, they went through the story of Factions, Eye of the North, and Prophecies. They were there for everything, in side quests and as henchmen where they weren't there for side quests. And these characters were like the iconic 5. For Guild Wars 2, there's an iconic 5, aren't there? There's Air, there's Logan Thackeray, there's Ritlock, and so on. But Guild Wars 1 also had a similar group just like them. And these were Devonna, Aiden, Sin, Menlo, and Eve. You might recognise these 5 names. They're actually 5 of the initial 6 professions that were introduced to the game. The Mesmer, actually, there was never a Mesmer in their team, which is always quite funny to me, and I always kind of privately think in my own head that the player character was kind of the secret 6th member of the group, and that member was a Mesmer. I think that'd be quite cool. But basically, there are these 5 characters, and they went through all the storylines. So for the summary, I came to the decision, right, this is who we're going to see their eyes through. When I'm talking about the events of Prophecies, we're going to be seeing it as if it's Devonna and her friends that are going through. Unless that's something seriously against canon, which I'm going to be checking with some big kind of lore people that know even more than me to be 100% sure that's fine. But in any case, this is something that I've decided to do. But it got me to thinking a lot about henchmen and the role that they play in the story, because generally, even though they could have been alongside you in the story, they never actually have an impact on anything. The story, for the most part, could go the exact same way if they were never chosen or never did anything at all. Which is why when Nightfall came around, they kind of blended these kind of main characters' ideas into henchmen of themselves, and that's where heroes are. Heroes are henchmen, essentially, that you can customize to a great extent in mechanics terms, but also heroes have a big part to play in the story as well, and actually have things to say in cutscenes and influences to be had during the missions and stuff, which is really cool. So they kind of fixed that again later with Eye of the North and with Nightfall, which is really cool. But the henchmen themselves do have actual story. Even though they don't have a massive impact on the main story, they do have other interesting things. Why I say this spotlight isn't necessarily just lore is because there's a lot to talk about with Henchmen. I've written down a list of some of the most interesting stuff to me. I might not segue from one point to the other very well, to be honest, today. But Henchmen, in case you aren't aware, in the game now, I haven't counted them all, but I think it's very close, if not over. I'm pretty sure it might be over 100 different characters. There were a hell of a lot of henchmen, and we're all familiar kind of with the story of Guild Wars 1, I'd say, just overall. Guild Wars 1 wasn't a story that was so long and so extensive that it had 100 super important characters. So this hopefully gives you an idea of how little of an impact henchmen really had on the story. There are over 100 of them if you include some new henchmen that were added to the game kind of recently, I guess, in an update where players could design their own henchmen for certain competitive PvP game types. If you exclude those, I think there's about 60 henchmen, which is still quite a lot. And even beyond that, you could get certain henchmen in various festivals, like Winter's Day. You could hire snowmen, and you could hire candymen during Halloween, which was a cool idea that they did with prophecies. Not so much with the newer celebrations, like the Canthan stuff, you don't get that. But in any case, there are a lot of henchmen. For a long time, their skills were kind of crappy. Their AI was quite crappy. Their AI is still pretty crappy. But when Nightfall came out, we were given the opportunity to flag them and move their positions around to a greater extent, which was really, really helpful. And also, at one point, their skill bars themselves, ArenaNet just went back through every single one and revamped them all. And now they're actually pretty damn good. In fact, in a lot of occasions, actually, I'd say that if you don't have heroes that are decked out with good skills or equipment themselves, then go for the henchmen, because the henchmen aren't actually that bad anymore, not since the skills are updated. Another really weird mechanic thing about henchmen, actually, is they move at 104% the speed of other characters in the game. Like, main players and heroes move at 100% speed, but these guys move at 104, and that's to kind of help them keep up with you if the AI causes them to bug out and sort of start lagging behind, which is really kind of cool. But then there's even weirder quirks in that some henchmen are bugged out and still only move at 100%, like Eve moves slower as a henchman than other henchmen do, which is a really weird thought, but that's a very weird little mechanics quirk that you might not have known about the henchmen. In general, they were pretty good. These days, they're pretty nice for actually being quite useful, but even still, once you've unlocked some heroes, they can be so much better for you because you can just tailor them to exactly what you want them to be. Probably the most common henchmen that actually exist in the game, as I said, a lot of their faces appear and disappear. Now, this could be because of the story of that henchman. Some of them have got their own little stories going on with them, or sometimes it's just a case of being in a totally different campaign where none of the characters are relevant. But you'd always have these main five: Devonna, Aiden, Sin, Menlo, Eve. They kind of, early prophecies, they're not there. They just appear in side quests, so it's disputable whether they really participated in everything in early prophecies. But particularly when Factions and Nightfall came out, for the later game stuff there, and the majority of the content beyond that, they're always henchmen. They're always there to be hired, and you can pretty much just say pretty confidently that they were there for most of the events of the game. There are a couple of other henchmen, actually. A couple that were introduced in Nightfall, and a couple that were introduced in Factions, like Talon, Silverwing, and Zoe, for example, that when Eye of the North came out, ArenaNet also added to as henchmen in the Eye of the North areas. So all the Eye of the North henchmen actually are henchmen we'd already met in previous campaigns, which is also quite cool. And it kind of escalated those characters like Talon and Zoe to become far more important to the overarching story, I suppose, because now they're not just these weird faction-specific characters, but they've got a lot more going on with them. In particular, I'd say Talon is quite a cool character just because he's a Tengu. This is a Tengu henchman. You don't often get henchmen that are of a different race to you, and especially with the Tengu, who often would be hostile to you. It was really cool to be able to have Talon there. And with Talon, you could hear a lot about myths of his people. He's kind of the guy that we learn about this prophecy that the Tengu have, that one day they'll go rise up and move to a new home, which kind of hints at their new home in the Dominions of Winds in Guild Wars 2. You can get a lot of dialogue, actually, speaking on those terms. You can get a lot of dialogue out of a lot of the henchmen. There was an update quite a long time ago now. I think it was like 2007. Originally, the henchmen didn't really say anything. You could speak to them in Outpost and they might give you a bit of filler information, but past that they wouldn't really have much personality. But there was an update, I remember so clearly when it came out, where they actually allowed the henchmen to talk. So you don't just hire them and they're not just these NPCs that run around, but they do talk about their environments, and they have different quotes when they're in battle and different quotes depending on what different parts of the world they're in. And really, if you do, you can spend a long time on the wiki. I warn you now, I'm not going to try to cover a lot of what they say, but you can get lost for a long time just reading all these interesting little quotes that these henchmen have. And they'll refer to each other, like Sin and Menlo have got all these little things about one another, about how they kind of might be in a relationship. And everyone's got something interesting to say, particularly, as I say, with Talon, who's a Tengu and just tends to be a lot more interesting just by virtue of that fact. You learn more about his culture. Zoe, as well, I've mentioned. She became a much bigger character in Eye of the North. She was kind of promoted from a regular henchman to something more when they introduced this big cool side quest which would get you a mini black mower chick, and she had this whole thing where you'd get this journal with her, and just a fantastic extra bit of character building. We always knew that she had only one eye in the game, but you never knew why. And then when Eye of the North came out and they kind of made her this more important henchman, you learn how she lost her eye, and there's all these little tie-ins from different quests. I had a lot of fun in the LP doing that stuff because it's so cool to be able to look across all the stuff in the campaigns and link it all together. It's really, really awesome. So yeah, the henchmen are interesting because even though the main storyline they might not have much to do with, they do have all their own little plots and quite a lot of depth to each and every single one of them. One of my favourite ones, while I was Let's Playing Prophecies, actually, I regretted that I never showed this off in the Let's Play, was that in early Prophecies there was a character, a henchman that appeared that was available for hire after a little while in the game. Like when you got to Greenwich Courthouse, I believe, so late in Ascalon stuff, just as you're about to leave Ascalon, a couple more henchmen appear in the game and you can start hiring these things. One of these henchmen is this guy called Little Tom, or Little Thom, I'm not sure how you're supposed to say his name, but this guy actually has a load of side quests that you could participate in earlier on in the plot of Prophecies, in early Ascalon stuff, and you find out that this guy actually is deserting the army, and from that point on in the story he's deserted Ascalon and ran away from the army, and people are looking for him, and you can now run along and hire him, and he'll reference it right at the end of the game. It's really, really cool. And there's all these little things where people pop up and disappear. Right at the end of Prophecies is when Devonna, Aiden, Sin, and Menlo and Eve, even though they've kind of been there with you in the plot, it's right at the end of Prophecies when you get to the Fire Island chain, they become available for hire as henchmen. And because they became available for hire, some of the older henchmen that you were using before no longer showed up. Like one of them was called Lena, and she was like your protection henchman, and she was later replaced by Menlo. So at the end of the game you could then go and speak to Lena, and she'd talk about why she wasn't there at the Fire Island chain. And it's like all these little subplots that enrich the whole experience of the main story, that if you just take the time when you go to a new region to talk to all the different henchmen that are there and focus on what they're saying as you run around, it really does enrich everything that's going on. Guild Wars, I think, has always failed a bit at being a character-driven game, but these are really cool little stories that are always running parallel to what's happening within the story, that it's easy to miss. And honestly, one of my most fun things pointing out to people when I was doing the LP and with these as well, it's really fun to be able to see these things because it's too easy to miss a lot of the story in Guild Wars, and it is all there. Really, this was supposed to be a hero and henchman spotlight. There's not much that I'm willing to say about heroes because, unlike henchmen, heroes do have a big impact on the story, and generally you'll know what the story of the hero is from knowing what the story of the game is. So if I were to say to you Vec, a hero that's in Eye of the North, if anyone's actually played Eye of the North, you pretty much know who that character is because they have extensive exposure in cutscenes and lots of stuff that they'll say during missions and quests and things. And generally the heroes are far better at being more fleshed out characters, and to talk about the heroes is at the same time to be just talking about the plot of the campaigns, which maybe I'll start doing on Guild Wars 2 Daily, but I think it's a bit weird to do a spotlight about something as obvious as the story of the campaign, because that's not going to be anything necessarily that new to people unless they just ran along not reading any quest text and skipping every single cutscene. But then I wonder, if you're someone like that, what's the appeal of watching this in the first place? Unless maybe you regret skipping everything, which I do see quite often. But anyway, there you go, guys. That's heroes and henchmen, mostly henchmen, I suppose. There were characters you could hire with you that could go through the game, where had a lot more depth to them than maybe you might have at first realised. There's some fantastic little stories that are just going on with them. Little Thom for me is probably one of my favourites. I just love his story of how he became this deserter. I believe right at the end, actually, they catch him again as well, which is quite funny. Some of them get married, like in factions. I believe 2 Mesmer henchmen get married right at the end. You find out that they kind of had this thing going on. Factions, in fact, had tons and tons of henchmen. It added so many, and they did a lot of interesting stuff where you'd be introduced to a lot of henchmen, and a big part of factions was that you had to make this big decision. Do you go to the Jade Sea or the Echovald Forest? And a lot of the henchmen had to make that decision too. So you saw this massive cast of henchmen, and then they suddenly all split, and half of them went one way and half went the other way, which was really really cool. So there you go, guys. That's heroes and henchmen. That's kind of the take that I'm going for with the summary series. You had all these characters that you can kind of credit with being the heroes of Tyria. These henchmen, by the way, will get references in Guild Wars 2. I've just been hearing about some of the ancestors of some of them have been found, and graves and things have been found, which is really cool, and something that I think Guild Wars 1 players will certainly very much appreciate. And maybe at some point, if I've got absolutely nothing left to talk about with Guild Wars 2, we can just start going down the list of these like 60 or so important the Henchmen and talking about every single individual one of them. I think what's more likely, though, is that we'll be talking about Devonna and so on a bit more. But really, that's going to be the next summary video for you guys. Not the Sunday coming up, but the one after that. We're going to be taking it'll be a bit of a mini episode, I suppose. It will be maybe half the length of the one we just saw, where we learn about these characters that we're actually going to be so important, and we're going to be following through prophecies. And after that, we'll kind of continue from there. So I'm excited about it. But yeah, there you go, guys. That was Guild Wars 2 Daily for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I guess I will see you tomorrow. See you next time, everyone.